You're listening to Edge of Faith, a multimedia magazine where we discuss art and culture through a Christian lens. So Holly, thank you so much for coming and talking to us about your new book, A Week in the Life of a Greco-Roman Woman. How are you doing tonight?
Oh, I'm doing well. Thanks for asking.
Sure, absolutely. So, the book is part of a whole series on a week in the life, and, like a week in the life of a Roman centurion, a week in the life in Corinth. So it's part of a series. Maybe you could start by telling the audience a little bit about that.
Oh, of course. The idea first came from Dan Reed, who was one of the top people at IVP, InterVarsity Press, which publishes the books. And he told me that he had seen a book written as historical fiction, but it traced a person's life through basically a real context at some point in time. And so he wanted to recruit New Testament scholars to do that for the world of the New Testament. So all the books are written by people who teach New Testament at colleges or seminaries or wherever. And so the point is that we're the kind of people who are supposed to know the ancient context of the first century Greco-Roman world. And then one of the points of the book is to show, or of the series, is to show how people's lives in that time and place would have been affected by their encounter with Jesus and or the gospel. So it traces them through daily life activities, things like hygiene, things like the local gods or goddesses that they might have worshipped already, and then they're supposed to be exposed in some kind of way to Jesus or followers of Jesus, and sort of imagine, what that could look like for them, or be confronted with both the hope and the challenge of the message of Jesus.
That's wonderful. I'd have to say, I've read several in the series, and you probably did one of the best jobs. I mean, we won't tell anybody, but it's like when
Oh,
when I'm
thank
reading about
you.
Anthea and she's hearing Paul at the marketplace off in the distance. I mean, it really brings a lot of that kind of thing to life. All of them do, really. That you just when you're reading it from Scripture and different things that are happening, you don't get all that background
Mhm.
and what life's like. It's wonderful. But I better back up because that's kind of my next question, which was I was hoping
Oh,
that
okay.
now you would share a little bit of this story, A Week in the Life of a Greco-Roman woman, and give us the general premise and maybe a peek in the life of Anthea.
Yes, so I set my main character in the book in the city of Ephesus, and I did that for a couple of reasons. First of all, the book of Acts in the New Testament is my favorite book, and Paul spends quite a bit of time in Ephesus in Acts 18 to 20 or so. So I felt like that would be a really fun and interesting narrative arc for my story, where my main character in my book could see some of these things that happen in Acts 18 to 20 that, normally we only read about in the book of Acts.
Right.
So my goal was to have her witness a lot of that, and then to show my readers of my book the kinds of reactions we think that someone in the ancient world at this time, especially someone in Ephesus, would have had to some of these events that happen in the book of Acts. Because in Ephesus, the patron goddess at the time, and actually for a long time, was the goddess Artemis. And she was very closely connected to the city in all kinds of ways. Her well-being is well-being, and people had to honor her appropriately and worship her appropriately. And with the message of Jesus, whom Paul proclaims as the true Lord, the true sort of ruler of everything, that's a direct sort of challenge to Artemis's power in the area. So I thought that would be an interesting connection to make for my readers of my book. So in Thea's life, throughout her week, you get to experience both sort of triumph and tragedy with her. The book begins with Anthea walking through a really basically tragic situation. Something really devastating happens to someone in her close circle. And as she's mourning that and trying to make sense of that, on the way to the market one day with her husband, she hears this man who is Paul, but she doesn't know it yet. She hears him dialoguing with another man in the lecture hall of Tyrannus. And that location, this lecture hall, we hear about in the book of Acts. We don't know exactly where that would have been in the ancient city of Ephesus, but we have really good guesses. So I put it in one of the locations close to the marketplace where we think it could have been. And she hears him talk about this Jesus person, and she is just sort of impressed by his confidence and his joy and his passion, but also kind of, in some ways, a little skeptical because he's saying so many things that she doesn't think could be true. I mean, how could that be? She wonders. So, but that piques her interest, and so she pays attention to him and looks for him even the next few days, and she talks about him with some of her female friends when they're hanging out, and of course, at least one of her friends has heard of him too, and so it's this whole sort of new vision for what commitment to a God, a different kind of God, could look like, because the only categories she has for that, of course, are the ones that were on offer in the city of Ephesus. And the way that Paul talks about this Jesus makes it sound like there are new categories being offered. So she has to ponder that and wonder about that and wonder what Jesus could do, in her life and what it would look like to commit to him. And in the meantime, she has to try to get something to feed her family that day. She helps with that process, which we think would have been true for a lot of women in the ancient world, that whatever the husband's trade was or whatever the husband did, basically the wife would support in that. And so with the kids, as soon as they're old enough, it would be a family affair. So she's doing that, and she's meeting with friends, and she's trying to take care of hygienic issues that come up, and she's pregnant in the book, and she's having some questions and concerns about her own pregnancy, and so there's a lot going on. But in the midst of it is this thread where she's wondering about this guy Paul, and then Jesus, and then she runs into some kind of acquaintance friends who have become members of this Jesus movement that the book of Acts calls that group the Way. That's how they identify themselves. So it's the language I use in the book. And they invite her to one of their meetings. So it's this whole sort of process. You're really in her head. It's first person narrative, and I wanted to write a book like that where we would see it from her eyes and hear her questions and kind of wonder along with her what to make of Paul and Jesus and people like Priscilla and Aquila that she meets too.
Right.
So that's a bit of a taste of her week in the book.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I found that fascinating, or at least enlightening, to go through the week of someone that was, the common person, not a wealthy woman, because, there was things like, well, on a good day, they got 2 meals. I mean, they were happy with that.
Yeah.
It wasn't like you were going to get 3, but 2 would have been great.
No.
And,
Yeah.
it's awesome when you are writing in that first person, because you see some of her astonishment. It's not that they're just challenging the gods that she's used to, but that the message they're bringing is really radical.
Yes.
Right?
Really radical, really hopeful in a lot of ways.
Absolutely. I mean, it's just stunning to them, and they have so many questions. The same questions people have today. So
yes, so true.
Exactly. So like I mentioned earlier, I really love the whole series. And what I like about them is they're not just a historical novel, which, might have some footnotes, but they're packed with, pictures and diagrams and charts and backgrounds of things. You really, when you're done reading it, not only are you entertained by the story, and honestly, the stories are good. I mean, I have to stop looking at the information sometimes because I'm caught up in the story. I'll come back for the information. But, when you're done, you walk away with a lot of information. It's a lot of research. And, so I guess one of the questions I had for you was, with all this research, was there a tidbit or two of revelation or something of enlightenment that you found more interesting than other things for that time period?
Oh, definitely. One of the realizations for me was honestly the scarcity of food for so much of the population. You already mentioned that, but we really think that a huge majority of the people in the Roman Empire in the first century would have lived basically either below subsistence level, and subsistence level is just what's needed to maintain life. I mean, that's survival, at subsistence level or just above it. So only the very sort of top few percentage points, if you were, giving 100% kind of the population, only that top few percentage points would have access to a lot of a lot of resources in terms of food and those kinds of necessities. And then maybe, a smaller percentage group beneath that as well, maybe anywhere from 8 to 10 or 15% had access to maybe modest amounts of extra resources, but most people would have worked dawn to dusk, 7 days a week, just to try to get something to eat that day. And the reality of that, and being happy if you had 2 meals, for example, was so powerful for me to think about in the context where I live, where there's so much food, so much extra. And this may sound kind of cheesy, but I really had a new appreciation for the kinds of foods that I was able to feed my kids. I thought, wow, look at all this bounty that I can give them for their young growing bodies. And so that was a really powerful realization for me. Also, before writing this book, I had dipped a little bit into some of the research on pregnancy and childbirth, but I really jumped into it for this book, and that really struck me too, just realizing the high mortality rates for women who were, attempting to have babies. Having babies was the most dangerous thing that most women in the ancient world would have ever done in their lifetime. Actually, and that's true in some contexts today still in our world, where having babies is the highest sort of risk to your life. So many women would have died either because of pregnancy complications or delivery complications, or maybe some kind of infection happened because of the delivery and they couldn't treat it, and so women would die because of that. And that was really, really sobering for me to realize.
Yeah, absolutely.
So those two are sad things, but I have one happier thing. I have one happier thing that I realized. Our best research tells us that probably most women, especially in a city like Ephesus, would have been out and about, during the day. Sometimes if you read the ancient sources, it sounds like a lot of women would have been sort of hidden away behind closed doors. But we think that only very elite families would have been able to live that way, actually. That's a sign of privilege, to sort of be able to cloister your women away and not have them out and about working and doing the kinds of things that the family needed to do to maintain survival. So just because survival was what most people were doing, women had to be a part of producing what the family needed, getting the resources, doing the work, and that would have meant that they would have been out and about. And I found that really refreshing to think of women, walking in the marketplace and being on the streets and using, in a city like Ephesus, the public latrines and the public baths even, because we think that would have been true for them. And that felt, in some ways, kind of liberating, actually. It's like I could picture Anthea, my main character, doing all of those public activities.
It's almost not unlike today. You see somebody at the grocery store or taking the kids to school, and wealthy people don't have to do those things. So,
right? That's actually well said. There
exactly.
is a parallel.
but
Yeah.
it is refreshing to think, even as you see today, how I guess it might be the same in the marketplaces, but there's so much, I guess, restriction to a woman's life in so many parts of life in the Middle East and in different areas, that you wouldn't really think about the fact that they got to walk around in the marketplace and things. It is crazy. So I guess, I don't want you to give away too much more of the story because people have to read it. I guess my final question for you would be, if there was just one thing you'd want a reader to take away from the story, what would that be?
I think I would want them to feel really powerfully and know really powerfully both the promise of following Jesus and what that would have looked like for someone in the ancient world, and the challenge of that. because, I mean, as I've already said, and you commented on this as well, there was so much hope and beauty that the gospel offered Anthea. And she's just so impressed by the way that followers of Jesus treat each other, for example, and all of that. But the challenge of it and the risk. So if you were a slave or if you were a woman and you wanted to follow Jesus, but the dominant man in your household, the father, the husband, if they weren't on board with that, if they didn't approve, that's serious risk to you, because the men had such control over that, and even things like abuse were common and socially accepted. So for so many people in the first century world, it would have been a huge commitment, a huge risk, and they would have known it, to follow Jesus. And I feel like sometimes in a context like the United States, we can lose some of the sense of that because it's usually not very risky for us. But it would have been for someone like Anthea, and to kind of sit in solidarity with her would be something I'd want my readers of my book to feel.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you definitely feel some of the anxiety she feels as she comes along.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right. Well, Holly, thank you so much, both for talking to us about the book and for just writing it. It was a wonderful book, and everyone needs to go grab a copy. Once again, A Week in the Life of a Greco-Roman Woman, IVP Press. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.